So would you, as a courtesy to the people sitting around you and to keep yourself from being terminally embarrassed, make sure your cell phone is in the off position? And thanks to all those people back there who make it possible for us to do this. Yes. And thanks to you who are watching online. And I'm going to take a risk. And I want to thank Arlene Wells for, don't shake your head like that, because she pulled off what I've been trying to do for a long time. We've been negotiating and negotiating, but we now have something signed. So I can announce to you that on September the 2nd, which is a Sunday, 9th, 22nd, September the 22nd, September the 22nd, which is a Sunday, Dr. Jackie Lewis will be here. Yeah. She is going to be preaching both services. We're going to have a church-wide lunch, and then we're going to gather, and she's going to spend the afternoon with us. If you don't know Jackie Lewis, go online and Google her. We had a deal signed with her. She was going to come and spend a long weekend with us, and then this little thing called COVID hit. It's right after Jeff McDonald came here. And so we did an online thing, and Holly and Jackie ended up thinking they should take their show on the road. It was just a wonderful time. So at any rate, I have wanted to have her back because she's so mild and soft-spoken before the election. And so she's going to come on the 22nd of September, and you will like her. I don't know if you those of you who remember seeing her, she's lead pastor of Middle Church in Manhattan, and right after she was here, their church caught on fire. You might remember that. And you remember she was at a Richard Rohr conference. This is where I first had an encounter with her. At any rate, I am so grateful to announce that she's going to be here. Anyway, so no matter who you are, where you are in your spiritual journey, you are celebrated here. So let's begin in silence. Let's take a deep breath and get here. And may grace be in our heads and in our thinking. Grace be in our eyes and in our seeing. Grace be in our ears and in our hearing. Grace be in my mouth and in my speaking. Grace be in our hearts and in our understanding, and may grace be at our ends and at our departing. So living in the living stream. And my beginning question is doing this any good? I am not looking for compliments. That's not what that question is about. If you have complaints, I would love to hear them before Jeff does. But it's a serious question, and I think as I go along, you might see the import of it. I know this is interesting for me, at any rate, and I think it is informative, and that may be truer for me than it is for you. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure it is. What I require of myself in order to stand here is very rewarding and very enriching for me. And it is exciting to me that there is so much more to learn and know. I mentioned to you last week how I have fallen in love with the writing of Jack Caputo. And this is not original with me. I don't remember where I got it. But you see this circle of the known? That's how much you know. And this is all out here is the unknown. And if this is an island, you see that if you were to stretch the length of the island out, it's not very big. So not very much of the island hits the unknown. But it's an interesting thing that as the known grows, so does the perimeter around the island. And so the island's unknown perimeter is bigger than it was when you know a little. So the more you know that you don't know. And that's very exciting to me. Sometimes it's interesting for me to read the stuff that I do to get here and do it. Sometimes being here is entertaining. You might remember, I've not checked YouTube or anything, but I'm sure it's gone viral by now. The famous vanishing Coke bottle. You don't see that in every Sunday school class. Or you remember the Sunday that some $50 went from here up through there to the glass? You don't see that every Sunday. Somebody asked me how that worked. And I'm going to tell you. It's a combination of a lot of practice, years of practice, self-discipline, self-denial. But mostly it's misdirection and manipulation. And magic. Because one of the first things you learn in Hogwarts is to be able to see things that are otherwise not seen. It's magic. So those $50 are up there somewhere in the sky, and the ability is to just see them and go up and get one like that. Now, for those of you in the cheap seats back there who weren't paying attention, you can do that again. You can get another one. Now, what I was taught yes, it's a real $50. So what I was taught in Hogwarts was that don't be greedy because you don't want to take too many. But it's just so fun to reach up and just continue to get coins where there were no coins. And you too can do this. 3 $50. The way this works is, as I said, manipulation and misdirection. So coins are manipulated, and then the magician sometimes misdirects. Now, when I first learned this, it was the foundation for a magic effect that you can go home and watch on YouTube today called the Miser's Dream, where the magician just keeps pulling coins out of the air, out of the air, out of the air, and putting them in a bucket. Yeah. But I had an ethical magic teacher who said that wasn't a good thing to do. And what he encouraged us to do was to take what we had pulled out of the air and put them back so that 3 coins become 2, just like that. Okay? Real coin. So you take another one, and I think I got it right there, which leaves you with 1. Right? And this coin, what you want to do, now this is, I'm going to tell you right away, that's misdirection. Because when I look at that hand, it makes you think that I put the coin in that hand, which I didn't. But it's not in this one either. So that is the magic effect for today. That's why I need a raise. But the question is, does the path of education really lead to change? The root word of the meaning to educate means to lead out from. And you and I are children of the Enlightenment, which, looking back on it, was not a period when there was much enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was run by white guys who had no room for women, and certainly no room for people of color. So how enlightened is that? Nonetheless, we were led out of, educated out of the Dark Ages into a more enlightened time. Now, I would wager that every person in this room thinks of him or herself as a reasonable person. Your partner may not share that opinion, or your children, but that's another story. Now, most reasonable people, such as we like to think we are, believe that if other people who disagree with us, especially about politics and our position on social and religious matters, they would just be reasonable. They too would share the same opinions that we share. But does that path of education truly lead to change? For example, I have read, as I hope you have, Ken Burns' commencement address given at Brandeis University. I've watched the video twice, and after each reading, after each viewing, I have declaimed, if every person in America would just watch this or read this, then our country might move toward healing. You've thought that. I've embraced this conviction for decades. I have believed that knowledge and information would lead people from destructive ideologies to vitalizing ones. And I thought I had data to back this up. For example, the period of shift in human history that Carl Jaspers called the axial age was a result of a breakthrough in consciousness that led to a time of more universal peace. This turning point took place somewhere starting around 900 BC, and at least 7 different places on the globe, well before there was an internet or anything like that, a shift occurred independently but simultaneously in China, India, Persia, Judea, and Greece in what Karen Armstrong calls the birth of the age of compassion. I've called it the birth of the age of the evolution of the religion of rightness, because this is when Buddhism came up with its eightfold path of a right way to be, a right way to live. This is the time when the Upanishads were written. It was a time of Buddha, Confucius, of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Ezra, Socrates. There arose all over the globe at one time in human consciousness an understanding that there's a right way to be. You won't find, you won't find a religion, a living religion on the planet that's devoid of this conviction. And the conviction is that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Or don't do something to you. Don't do something to someone that you wouldn't want to have done to you. So these people moved to another level of consciousness. And I've talked in here at length on numerous occasions about levels of development and growth. And my belief is that our primary purpose on this planet, after we met the basic survival needs, is to grow. But it's clear to me that globally and certainly nationally, we've regressed from this consciousness. The African-American preacher and scholar, you may see him showing up from time to time on TV talk shows, Dr. William Barber, who teaches at Yale. He's written a lot of books. His most recent book is called White Poverty, that reveals that 800 people a day die in this country as a result of poverty. In a affluent nation that can afford so much weaponry for ourselves and our current allies. I say current because you never know when that's going to change. We could afford to fix this if we had the will to do so. Why don't we? What has happened or is happening to us if someone wants to claim that this is a Christian nation, and if, as can clearly be shown, Jesus' command was not only to love God, but love your neighbor and to take care of the least of these, we're not measuring up to that. So my question is doing this making any difference? I've been a firm believer in the value of education, as I've claimed the identity of being an educator for decades. But I have a confession to make. From the beginning of the shift that I made in developing from magical consciousness to a more rational form of consciousness, that is, not believing in the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus and that sort of thing, to more understanding of how human community work, I confess that I have traveled a path based on what resonated with me. That makes sense? I'll talk more about that in a moment, but largely I have followed a bias I have had toward the things I wanted to learn, toward teachers who appeal to me. And this has been true for even those matters that have been far outside my comfort zone. There was just something about what I was hearing and potentially learning from the people that I was attracted to that seemed so right. And I would say that when I want to leave room for the exceptional insider experience that drags us unwillingly from one level of consciousness to another, that really the test for a wise and useful spiritual path is, does it resonate with you? Does this feel right? I took great comfort from what I learned about the first axial age. The comfort is entire populations can be changed. They can become more enlightened. Now, you probably will not be surprised to hear that I could cite for you a long list of books that support the point of view that I'm making right now. But I'll mention just one of them. This book, The Book of Joy, is probably the only book I have ever read from cover to cover in one sitting. That sitting was a 13-and-a-half-hour flight from Rome to Houston, but I can't sleep coming this direction. This book is a series of recordings of dialogue between these two spiritual giants, and it was put together to prepare for a documentary that's now out about them. You can watch it on Netflix, I think. The documentary is not nearly as good as the book. But in summary, they both conclude that educating people everywhere about the content of the first axial age is the solution to our problem. If everyone could embrace the notion that treating others like we want to be treated would alleviate our problems, that would fix us. Because who wants to have hateful slurs slung at them? Who wants to be attacked and excluded over something about which they have no control? The color of their skin, their economic status, their education status, their sexual orientation. What family wants children to be separated from parents, like some of our immigration policies have dictated? Oh, no. So educate people, that'll solve our problems. Now, you might notice that the people who need this education aren't here. And that's what began to concern me, because I started having conversations with some folks who just pointedly told me that I was wrong, that this education doesn't do any good. That's the kind way to put it. They showed me there that my position was naive. When I said to one, what spurred this was I said, if everybody could just read Ken Burns' speech, that'd be great. And one of them said, that's useless. And he quoted a Indian polymath of the 3rd century who said, books are as useful to a stupid person as a mirror is to a blind person. I am a huge fan of the satirical writer Andy Borowitz. You know him? I followed him for years, and he recently had a column in which he quoted Marjorie Taylor Greene as saying that if the Biden administration persisted in putting up windmills to generate electricity, that before long, air was going to be up to $4 a gallon. The sad fact is that there are people in our population who do not understand that's a joke. Here's something that's not a joke. I'm sure you know that the governor of the state of Louisiana has signed a law into effect that every classroom in every public school and state-supported university must now put up a poster listing the 10 Commandments. There is in the Wall Street Journal, by the way, yesterday, an editorial pro and con of this. Andy Borowitz reported on it and said, quote, Louisiana orders classrooms to display all 10 commandments that Trump has broken. I want to quote him. Governor Jeff Landry said the poster would enable students to keep track of how many commandments they have broken so they can better follow Trump's example. And at the end of each year, teachers will issue a report card indicating which commandments the students have broken and which they have not. And if they've not broken all 10, they will be required to repeat the grade. We want Louisiana students to grow up to be productive felons. He went on to say, critics, however, said the law would give some students unfair advantage since children of Republican officials start learning how to break the 10 Commandments almost from birth. So on Andy Borowitz's site, I saw that he had done an interview, a very serious interview with one of our politicians, and I watched that. It's a very erudite, sophisticated interview. And I noticed that Andy Borowitz has a very serious book, which I read. And the book is Profiles in Ignorance: How America's Politicians Got Dumber and Dumber. And in it, he says some things that ought to wake us up as a nation. For example, he said, we've been lab rats in a perverse American experiment, seemingly designed to answer this question: who's the most ignorant person the United States is willing to elect? And that is no joke. And I'm going to do some of this, elaborate on some of this next week, so come back. This dumbing down process started in the 19th century when people started reading fewer and fewer books. And in the absence of knowledge, fear and hate, which lead to violence, just fills the void. However, Borowitz ends up not being very encouraging about the trajectory being changed because our culture, not you, but the rest of the people out there don't really value an educated public. And just when you think we have reached the bottom of the barrel in collective stupidity, something comes up to remind me of my cluelessness and our nation's difficulty. In an online version of the news magazine I subscribe to, which is called The Week, there was this paragraph this week. Delegates at the July's Republican National Convention in Milwaukee will be allowed to carry AR-15 rifles inside the event's security zone. Under Wisconsin law, cities can't enact restrictions on firearms that go beyond state regulations, so most all guns will be allowed at the RNC. I'm still quoting, but get this insanity. Alderman Scott Spiker notes that canned goods will be prohibited because they could be thrown. One of my colleagues who is very well acquainted with all the growth models that we've talked about in here, he's kind of a Ken Wilber expert. He said that the majority of the people in our culture right now are not interested in growth. Rather, they're interested in winning for their side. And then he added a zinger, just like you're interested in winning for your side. I didn't need to hear that. So I stopped and I reflected, and I decided that to some degree, all of us are self-righteous hypocrites. Because once we have accepted a particular narrative, we become blind to everything else. And I'm as guilty of this as people on the far right. I am no more willing to get my news from the sources they look to than they are willing to look to the sources that I get my news from. That's just a fact. And so we end up shouting at each other across the divide, why don't you listen to reason? There is a reality about we humans that in psychology, especially the aspect of brain and mind study that focuses on cognitive awareness, the cognitive levels of change that we have talked about in here numerous times. And it's called motivated ignorance. Motivated ignorance refers to willfully blinding oneself to facts. It's choosing not to know. In many cases, for many people, knowing the truth is simply too costly, too psychologically painful, too threatening to their core identity. People actively decide to remain in a state of ignorance. If they're presented with strong arguments against the position they hold or compelling evidence that disproves the narrative they embrace, they will reject them. Doing so fends off the psychological distress of realizing that they've been lying to themselves and to others. It does not apply to a person in this room, but I do want us to look at it. Because I think every one of us is guilty of this. When I first wrote this, I was hesitant about using the word guilt, but I think it fits. I mentioned a few moments ago that from the beginning of my conscious life, and I don't know why, because my brother, who came out of the same mother and father unit, took a path that was far to the right. I didn't. And from the beginning, I had this inclination to go in one direction. I had a tendency to listen to certain speakers and authors and reject others, to look to certain news sources and reject others. This has been my bias from the beginning. It's called a confirmation bias. And I think maybe it might be helpful for us to look at some of these, because this teacher that we are attempting to follow, Jesus, said, you better tend to the 2x4 that's sticking out of your own eye before you attempt the delicate surgery of removing a splinter from your neighbor's. So this bias that I've been referring to is the confirmation bias. We evaluate any new information that comes to us by saying, this fit what I believe, what I already know. And if it doesn't, go into my framing story, it goes out. So my assumption that reasonable people will see things as I do is not a reasonable assumption at all. The fact is that people can't see what they can't see. Further, we live in a very complex world with things becoming more complex all the time, and most people don't like complexity. We like things simple and easy. Next week, we will see exactly where this bias leads us when it comes to understanding Jesus. I just believe this and you're okay. That's it. Simple. But the fact is that many people, because of complexity bias, prefer a simple falsehood to a complex truth. And then one of my mother's favorite lines designed to control was, she didn't call me Bill, William, what will people think? Which really meant, if you do that or say that, what will people think about me? But that's how she framed it. And the fact is that we do care what people think about us. The only people who don't care what other people think about them are sociopaths or politicians. And though it is hard for we reasonable people to admit, we have an entire set of assumptions, prejudices, likes, dislikes, fears, conflicts of interest, blind spots, and obsessions that keep us from seeing things that we would see if we didn't have these things. Now, most of us have a tendency to place ourselves to either the right or the left of center. By the way, if you've ever wondered where the terms right and left came from, it's from an event that happened in 1789 in the French Assembly, where there was a debate put before the French Assembly about, are we in favor of making these progressive changes, or do you want to keep things the way they have been? And the people who were in favor of making the progressive changes sat on the left-hand side of the chamber, on the left of the king. And the people who were not in favor of making changes but wanted to keep things as they were sat on the right. Okay? That's where that came from. Interestingly, the clergy sat on the right. Historically, that's where it happened. There's contact bias. Research has shown over and over and over again that when people have sustained intimate contact with those they consider the other, then their prejudices and false assumptions begin to fall away. E.B. White wrote, "Prejudice is a great time saver. You can form opinions without having to get the facts." Here is a huge bias, the cash bias. One of the reasons, not the only one, that slavery maintained such a hold over certain parts of this country was slavery provided free labor. And people knew if they gave it up, they would have to pay. So the cash bias worked. Most of us can remember when heads of tobacco companies, all men, sat in front of a congressional hearing, asked the question, do you think nicotine is addictive? And they all to a person said no, even though they had the facts in front of them, because to say yes would upset the market and their shareholders. How about executives of the NRA? I have a friend who has worked for years for a fossil fuel business, various aspects of it. And so he took strong umbrage that that industry had at any level, in any way, anything to do with the human contribution to climate change. But he was so good, he is so good at his management skills that he got hired by a renewable energy company. True story. And now his tune has changed. That's the cash boss. We take on the attitudes and accents, beliefs, and behaviors of the culture in which we live. In one experiment, people from the United States were asked to write 20 statements beginning with the words, I am. And they listed their own internal psychological characteristics. I am happy, I am outgoing, I'm interested in jazz, etc., etc. East Asians are asked to perform the same exercise, and they wrote about their roles and relationships. I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm an employee of Nissan. The culture in which we live creates our biases. We are blind